Okay, well, very exciting. We're going to be starting a new topic tonight. We're going to be starting Hilchos Shabbos, and hopefully we'll be able to study Hilchos Shabbos together over, next several months or so. Um, so that I'll kind of just lay out, what the plan will be. Tonight will be a little bit of, I'd call it maybe more of like introductory shir, where we'll go into, talk about Avos Malachos, if familiar with the term, an Av Malacha and a Told Malacha, what are Malachas? So that's going to be the topic of tonight's shir. And then um, over the next next several months, we'll focus on each of these Malachos individually, and how they come up, what relevant halachos come from it. So that's sort of going to be the plan. But for tonight, let's kind of just introduce it a little bit. So before we begin any discussion about talking about Hilchos Shabbos, um, one of the uh, one of the most amazing pieces to read is the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah wrote his commentary on or Chaim in Shulchan Aruch, halachas of daily living, and he has his introduction to his entire commentary, but then he has a separate introduction before he discusses Hilchos Shabbos, and he makes a few points there, where he mentions if you want to really take redemption seriously, it's important to take Hilchos Shabbos seriously, because until we're careful about Halachos Shabbos, we're not going to get redemption. He says that Shabbos is like equivalent to all the mitzvahs of the Torah. He said that if you look at all the punishments in the Torah, the worst punishment, he goes through, this punishment is worse than this, which is worse than this, and the worst punishment of all is to get a skila, to be stoned. And he says that's a punishment that one receives for desecrating Shabbos. He says, so you see how important Shabbos is. And then finally he concludes by saying that that it's nice to want to keep the halachos of Shabbos, but unless one studies it, it's really impossible to keep it properly, because there's so many mistakes somebody can make. You might do this incorrectly, you might just be trying, right? But unless you're able to study the halachos of Shabbos, you're not going to know what's permitted and what's prohibited. So that's why it's so important. The Mishnah Berurah writes that's why it's so important to actually study halachos Shabbos. So that's a great piece to read. It's in the Mishnah Berurah, the Hakdama to this is his introduction to the third part. It's a beautiful piece. But in regards to us tonight, let's just talk a little bit about what is an Av Malacha and what is a Tolda. So Rabbi Ribiat, he has these amazing books. Rabbi Ribiat is a contemporary of he's alive right now. And he wrote the sefer called 39 Malachos, where it's in Hebrew, it's also in English, where he really spends a lot of time talking about the halachos of Shabbos. So he writes in his book, he wants to define what an Av Malacha is. He says that each Malacha, well, first of all, one second, let me just make sure everyone knows what a Malacha is. Malacha means, a prohibited work, prohibited, um, activity that we're not allowed to do on Shabbos. So it's malacha literally means work or activity. So Rabbi Ribia says that each malacha, each activity of the Mishkan has a set of characteristics with which many similar activities can be identified. In other words, each of the malachas actually represents a category of related activities that are all included in the restriction of that malacha. The key to knowing what is included in the malacha category lies in first understanding the basic elements and characteristics of the Av malacha. So what he's saying is that when we refer to the 39 malachos, that there's 39 prohibited activities on Shabbos, on a biblical level. So Rabbi Riviat is explaining it doesn't mean 39. It means there's 39 categories. 39 categories, and each category is called an Av. Av literally means a father. So those are the 39 categories of activities which are prohibited on Shabbos on biblical level. Um, so that's his definition, and it's interesting to know that that there are 39 avos malachos, 39 categories of malachos, and while they are prohibited on a biblical level, they're given very little airtime in the Chumash. The Gemara in Chagiga writes that the halachos of Shabbos, it describes they're like hararim hatluyim besara, which means they're like mountains hanging by hairs. What does that mean? It means that there's like a mountain of halachos that come out, which is based on very little, which is, hanging by this hair, because there's very little that's written in the actual Chumash about the malachos. And we have all these, we have a whole Masechta Shabbos describes all 39 malachos and all the commentaries on it, but it's on the very little psukim which actually speak about it. But there are actually a few malachos out of the 39, which the Torah actually does describe. Um, 39, and there's three, possibly, maybe two, maybe just one. And there's very few of them that the Torah actually does describe. So the question is, how come these categories, these malachos, are identified out of the other 39? Why these? What are these three, and why these three? So the first one is what we would call habara, which is lighting a fire. And that's written pretty explicitly in a pasuk in Shmos, writes, Lo tevaru eish bechol moshavos echem b'yom haShabbos. You should not light a fire in any of your dwelling houses on Shabbos. So the Gemara in Shabbos actually says, actually asks this question: how come the Torah mentions this? Mostly all the other malachos are not mentioned. Why did lighting a fire? How come that is mentioned as opposed to anything else? So it's actually, like you could maybe guess, it's a machlokas in the Gemara there, as many things are. So it's two opinions. Rabbi Yossi is of the opinion that the reason why lighting a fire is mentioned is, he says, because it's actually not even a malacha. It's just a what we'd call a lav. Means it's a prohibition, but it's not it's not it's not including one of the categories of malachos. So he's saying that, if something's actually mentioned, it can't be it's a malacha. And there are other examples of this: prohibitions on Shabbos, which we would call lav, which would mean they're just prohibited, and some of them are even prohibited biblically. And they're not, they don't fall into these 39 categories. There's Tchum Shabbos, or making sure your animals rest, or that your kalim, your items rest, and those are examples of things which are prohibited on a biblical level, and they don't fall into categories of 39 malachos. So he says, so too, lighting a fire doesn't fit into this category, and that's why it needs to be mentioned separately. But that's not agreed by everyone. Rabbi Nassan, he argues, he says, no, the reason why the Torah mentions lighting a fire is to teach you something very important. That he says havar lechalik yatzas, which means not only is it a malacha, it's actually we would say a paradigm for other malachos. In how so? In teaching that if in one period you were able to do 3 or 4 malachos, you'd be obligated for every single malacha individually. Like, let's say you lit a fire, and in the same time you separated, which we're going to say is one of the malachos, and you grinded all at once. Somehow you managed to be able, you're trying to win a Vera contest, and you're able to do that all at the same time. So Rabbi Nassim says we learn from the fact that the Torah mentions lighting a fire, so we learn that you're going to be obligated for every single one. So that's why I get separate one. So that's lighting a fire. There are other examples too, maybe. Another example is plowing and harvesting. The pasuk in Shmos, it says, Sheishes yamim, 6 days, tavod, you should work. Vayom hashvi, on the 7th day, tishbos, you should rest. Becharisha vekatzir, with plowing and harvesting, tishbos, you should stop. So what does that mean? So it sounds like it's saying that you can't plow and harvest on Shabbos, right? 6 days you can work. On the 7th day, don't plow and don't harvest. You should rest, right? That's what it sounds like. But one opinion says no, that's in the Gemara Makos says no, that's not talking about Shabbos. That's talking about something else that has six years, yes, seventh year. No, what would that be? Anyone know? Shemitah. Shemitah, right? Shemitah is 6 years. Yes, seventh year, no. Since that pasuk's not talking about Shabbos. You know why? Because the malachos of Shabbos are not mentioned in the Torah. Um, but Rabbi Shmuel, he disagrees. He says, no, it is talking about Shabbos. So why would this be mentioned when all the other malachos are not mentioned? He says, because it's coming to teach you that harvesting, when you have to do a kitsira, a harvesting for the Omer, when you bring the Omer during the spheres Omer, you bring the Omer, so that actually overrides Shabbos. So it's coming wants to teach us as a very specific halacha, right? That harvesting for the Omer overrides Shabbos. That's why it's mentioned. But normally it shouldn't be mentioned. Then finally, one more is that another possible one is that the Gemara in Shabbos says that takes the pasuk in Shmos that this is what the pasuk says. Vayitzav Moshe commanded Vayavir kol b'machaneh, and he made this decree in the camp, Limor ish ve'isha, a man and a woman, al yasu od melacha letrumas hakodesh, that nobody should bring any more donations, vayikaleha me'avi, and the nation stopped bringing. So, what does that pasuk have to do with any sort of malacha? So the Gemara in Shabbos says, even though the simple understanding of that pasuk is, when we go over the parsha, we think that means because Bnei Yisrael, they brought so many donations, right? And Moshe said, enough, we don't need any more, stop it, right? We have enough. But the Gemara in Shabbos says no, that really Moshe told them they had to stop because Shabbos was coming, and he didn't want them to violate the prohibition of carrying, hotzah, removing, carrying. So he said, stop bringing. That's how the Gemara in Shabbos writes. So if so if this is really referring to a malacha, which is carrying, removing the malacha of hotzah, why does it get a special pasuk? So there, Tosfos writes in Shabbos, he writes that no, that hotzah, carrying, removing, needs a special pasuk because it's actually, there are 39 categories of malachos, right, that we keep mentioning, but carrying hotzah it's of the 39, but really it's its own category. It's what we'd call a malacha gerua. Gerua means like so it's 39, but it's it's a little bit falls below them. It gets its own category. And there's a lot of different opinions of what it means. Hotzah malacha gerua, that carrying is worse than the other malachos. Many different opinions. One opinion, which I think about is pretty interesting, is that Tosfos Harash, he writes that what does it mean that hotzah, carrying, removing, is we would call a malacha gerua, meaning a little bit less than regular malacha. It means that it's only prohibited on Shabbos, but it's not prohibited on Yontif. So that's why you can carry, you don't need an Eruv if you want to carry on Yontif, because it's not a problem. You're allowed to do hotzah on Yontif. That's the Tosfos Harash's opinion there. But in general, though, the point is that most of these malachos, they're not really mentioned at all in the psukim. But as we go through them, we're going to see that still they are prohibited, and we have to understand why exactly they are prohibited. So there's everyone has we'll say like this, that the avos malachos, the traditional understanding is that they have something to do with the Mishkan. It's just what exactly does it mean? Why does it make sense? And what are we exactly saying when we say that the 39 categories of malachos of Shabbos have something to do with what was done in the Mishkan? So the Gemara in Shabbos on 49b says, how do we know? Gemara asks, how do we know there are 39 malachos? Right? You keep telling me, Roey, you keep saying there's 39 malachos. Where did you get that from? So the Gemara in Shabbos says two answers. Number one, either it was learned from the service that was done in the Mishkan, or that's answer number one, from what was done in the Mishkan, that they learned that there were 39 malachos. Seemingly, there were 39 malachos done in the Mishkan. So 39 malachos done in Shabbos. answer number two is that I didn't count, but this is what the Gemara says. If you count the times it says malacha, the word malacha in the Torah, it gets to 39. So you know there are 39 malachos. Maybe someone needs to go down, project and probably it's not so hard nowadays. You just do search on like Safari, you can probably count it. But that's what the Gemara says that it says the word malacha 39 times. So that's how we know 39 malachos. So the Rambani explains. He says, really, that's not. They're not actually arguing about what you think they're arguing about, because everyone agrees that malachos have to be learned from the Mishkan, because it's just, as we go through the malachos, it's just going to become very clear that that's true. So what is this machlokes in the Gemara and Shabbos? The machlokes is, the first opinion that only mentioned the Mishkan and didn't mention anything about the 39 times. They really have the opinion that everything in its entirety is learned from the Mishkan, both the number 39 and also all the details of these malachos. The second opinion says, no, we got the number 39 because we counted the amount of times it writes the word malacha in the Mishkan, and all the details are derived from the Mishkan. But the Gemara in Shabbos basically says that, concludes that you're only going to be obligated for a malacha, for an av malacha, you're only going to be obligated for a malacha if it's done in a similar way to the way it was done in a Mishkan. So the question is, what does that mean? What does it mean when we say it was done in a similar way to it was done in the Mishkan? It doesn't mean that it was done in the way, these are activities that were done in the building of the Mishkan, or does this mean that these were activities done in, the daily activity, the serving, everything that was done in the Mishkan on a daily basis? So that's a machlokas also, which makes sense. So Rashi is of the opinion that we define an av malacha. These categories of malachas are defined by something that was done in the construction, the building of the Mishkan. But Rav Hai Gaon, he disagrees with Rashi. He says, no, in av malacha, these 39 categories of malachos are defined by something done in the daily performance of the Mishkan, and we call it avodas Mishkan. So that becomes relevant. Many ways, give maybe two, that number one is baking. We would say afia, baking. So Rav Hai, he's of the opinion that it's av malachos are defined by something done in the daily service in the Mishkan. So Rav Hai would say baking, yeah, that's an av malacha. When did they bake in the service of the Mishkan? They had to bake the matzahs for the korban mincha. They had to make the lechem. So they did baking all the time. Of course, that's going to be that's an av malacha. Rashi writes this, that he says, no, when we say baking, it doesn't really mean baking. Baking really means cooking, baking, cooking, same thing, because cooking was actually done in constructing the Mishkan. Where was cooking done? Why would they cook? They were just putting up the Mishkan. So that was done they had to actually cook the dyes, because they had all these dyes that on the covers of the Mishkan, right? So they had to cook those dyes. So cooking was done in the building of the Mishkan, the construction, but baking wasn't done. So baking and cooking is really the same thing. So Rashi has to say that because he's of the opinion that it's the construction of the Mishkan. Rav Hai, who holds that it's the daily service of the Mishkan, so he can learn he can learn it like you would think to learn it, that baking means baking, because baking and cooking are not the same thing. Another example is rolling, is called malila. So that's an activity that's done in when you bring a korban omer. So Rav Hai would say, yeah, rolling is called an av malacha, but Rashi says, no, I don't even hold this called av malacha. This is only prohibited rabbinically. And there are many examples like that, differences between Rashi and Rav Hai Gaon. Okay, but now that we said that there's av malachos, so and there are different opinions about what makes something an av. Was it just anything done in the Mishkan? Was it something that was important that was done in the Mishkan? Maybe it needed both. But either way, we have a tradition. We know what all the av malachos are. The Mishnah in Shabbos tells us all the av malachos. There are 39 of them. You could do a quick Google search. It'll tell you all the all the 39 malachos, but we're going to spend time on each of them individually. Um, so the next thing to know, though, is that not only are there av malachos, which is the categories of malachos, there's something called the told of a malacha. So Rabbi Ribbiat, he's very good at this. He describes what exactly is a tolda. He says the primary act that was actually performed in the Mishkan represents the root of the malacha and is called the Av Malacha, literally the father of the malacha. That's the primary act. And again, the act that was actually performed in the Mishkan. This Av Malacha dictates the basic elements necessary to be included in the category in much the same way that a father's genetic makeup determines the traits in his offspring. While the offspring may not be completely identical to the father, their basic characteristics are. Activities similar in their basic characteristics to those of the Amalacha are called toldos, which he defines as sub-activities. So there are avos, which is again the father of the malacha, and then toldos, which is derivatives of the av malacha. So he gives you a few examples. He says example of av malacha is zoreya. Zoreya means planting. So we can't plant means they did planting in the Mishkan. He says, but the premise of zoreya, the premise of planting includes, means promoting plant growth in any way, because that's what you're doing when you're planting. So he says, watering a plant, right? If you're going to water a plant, you're also promoting plant growth. It's not the same as actually planting it in the dirt. So it's a derivative of the father of the malacha, and that's called a tolda, right? And that's going to be also prohibited. Another example is to malabain, which means like cleaning. So he says washing soiled clothing. Sorry, yeah, washing soiled clothing is the av malacha, but the premise of cleaning includes, that means taking soiled clothing in with water and washing it out. So he says the premise of that means is just to clean any fabric of any color by any means necessary. So he says scrubbing stains from a dried garment, even if you're not using water, it's a derivative because again, you're accomplishing the same goal, which is to clean the garment. And he says a third example is tofer. Tofer is sewing. So it's sewing two or more stitches in a seam. Says so that's how you violate the av. But the premise again is the bonding of any two objects to form a single entity. So he says gluing or taping two sheets of paper, but it's not the same action as sewing. You're not exactly sewing, but you're accomplishing the same thing. So he says that's a tolda, the derivative of tofer of sewing, and again prohibited. Okay. The question is though, this I think we'll do first. The question is, okay, so there's avos and there's toldos. You tell me there's both prohibited. So what's the difference? Who cares whether you call something a nav or whether you call something a tolda? They're both not allowed. So and and what's important is that a tolda, even a derivative, is prohibited biblically. So, if something were to be prohibited, there's a big difference between something prohibited biblically versus rabbinically. You can be a lot more lenient in general when you have something which is prohibited on a rabbinic basis. Of course, I'm saying you can't simply just, wave it off because it's rabbinic. Of course, we value very much Isurim derabanan, mitzvahs derabanan, but I'm saying when you're talking about situations where you need to be lenient for whatever reason, the fact that something is rabbinic versus something which is biblical is a big difference. But that's not a difference between avos and toldos. Both avos and toldos are prohibited biblically, the oraisa. So what is the difference between the two? So the Gemara in Shabbos asks this question. Does, hey, what's the difference between the two? Why are you making such a big deal if they're both everything's prohibited? So the Gemara says, this is the difference. If you do two avos or two toldos of two categories, you are chayiv twice. But if you do an av and it's tolda, you're only going to be chayiv once. Should I say that again? Probably right. Say that again. That if you do, so if you were to do one av, right, and then you should do another av, so you're going to be obligated for two separate things, right? That was what we mentioned earlier. That was the Gemara learned from lighting a fire. That to do two separate avos malachos, you're going to be obligated for two things. But if you do an av, right? So let's use one of our examples that we know already. If you do planting, right, and then you do watering, and you do them at the same time, so says the Gemara, in that case, you're only obligated one because it's an Av and it's Solda. And that's really the only difference between the two. Wow. That's the only difference between the two. That's what the Gemara says. But then the Gemara says, okay, but there's opinion of Rabbi Eliezer who says, no, that even when you do an Av and it's Solda, you get two punishments. So what's the difference? So the Gemara says, yeah, there's no difference. They're just, one are the categories and one of the derivatives of the categories, and both of them are prohibited. And that's sometimes there are actual differences between the two, which we'll get to later on, a little more complicated and needs some more introduction. But in terms of what the Gemara says, that the only difference between the two is if, according to the opinion that if you do a nav and it's tolda, you're only going to be chayv once. And finally, we'll finish with this, which is that this is not related to Shabbos per se, but it's just I think fun to know, which is that do we say that every single time we have an av, like not just in Shabbos, but halacha in general, that every time there's something that's an av, when there's something called an av, does that mean that there's always going to be a tolda? Every time there's a father category, does there always mean there are derivatives? So that seems to be a little bit of a machlokas in between two Gemaras, because the Gemara, as relates to Shabbos, the Gemara says Shabbos, Ayin 70a, says um the reason why we know there are toldos is because there's an extra letter in the pasuk. It says achas mehina, okay, but the point is that the Gemara and Shabbos had to derive that there are toldos from a pasuk, and didn't know, even though there's something called avos, even though there's something called fathers, but he didn't know that there were necessarily toldos. But the Gemara in Bava Kama, if you remember from Daf Yomi not so long ago, that the Gemara opens up Daf Beis and it says from the fact that the the Mishnah says there are avos, right? There are avos of nezikin, there are avos of damages. It's mashma, it implies that there are going to be toldos. So which one is it? Do we say that all avos have toldos, or do we say that not all avos have toldos? So that's so it seems to be machlokas gemara, and it's actually machlokas. Then it comes into machlokas between the Rishonim. The Mari Katz, he says that really all avos have toldos. So why did it in Shabbos? Why did it need to tell us a specific pasuk to tell us that? Is because you would have thought Shabbos has no toldos because, like we said, the malachas of Shabbos, the activities of Shabbos are limited to what's done in the Mishkan. So you might have thought that, only stuff done in the Mishkan are going to be prohibited. And you're not going to have derivatives. So that's why we need to specifically say that, really there even are toldos which, weren't necessarily done in the Mishkan. Tosfos, he learns differently. He says no, there generally are toldos, and he deals with the Gemara in Bava Kama. But that's an interesting discussion. And it comes up. Be like, for example, so the Gemara has in Moed Katan that it says, we can go back to Shemitah that you can't plant during the seventh year. Okay, we talked about planting. We know there's a told of planting, which is watering your ground, right? So is that also prohibited during Shemitah, or maybe it's not? Because do we say that just because there are avos which are prohibited in Shemitah, which is planting, does that mean that also the derivatives are prohibited too? So that seems to be a Gemara and Moed Katan, a little discussion there. But as far as relates to us, I think we'll stop there on Avos and Toldos. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask.
Yeah. Okay.